Hello, and welcome to Brada Tales. Tonight, we're bringing you a selection of eerie stories paired with the soothing sound of rain to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Before diving into the atmosphere of suspense, leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from and what time it is. If these stories send chills down your spine, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Get comfortable, let the fear gradually envelop you, and tell us what kind of stories you'd like to hear next time. Settle in, we're about to begin. It was a regular morning. At least, I thought it was. The sun hadn't quite risen yet, casting a muted glow through the blinds. I still felt the remnants of sleep in my bones, the kind of heaviness you can't shake off no matter how many times you stretch. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and reached for my phone, hoping to catch up on the news. But what greeted me wasn't anything I expected. A notification blinked on the screen, obituary, my name, day of death, January 31st, 2025. My heart skipped a beat. I froze for a moment, staring at the words. My name. The date. The words that are supposed to mean the end of everything. But this wasn't real. It couldn't be real. It was just some mistake, some bizarre glitch, maybe even a prank. I tapped the notification. There was no link. Only a small box that said, "Error, page not found." Confused, I opened my browser and typed the URL from the notification, but the page wouldn't load. It didn't exist. Not now. Not ever. I took a deep breath. It had to be some sort of error, right? Some malfunction in the system. Maybe I had typed the wrong address. But it still didn't explain the sense of unease that crawled up my spine. My body tensed, as if the weight of the notification had seeped into my muscles. A deep, instinctual fear that something was wrong. But what could be wrong? It was just a weird mistake. I leaned back against the pillow, trying to clear my head, but my phone screen kept flashing in my mind. I forced myself to get up, brushing off the lingering sense of dread. I checked the time, still early. Too early to be so shaken. As I stepped into the kitchen to make coffee, I tried to focus on the mundanity of the morning. The sound of the kettle boiling, the rhythm of my movements, the soft hum of the fridge. Yet, in the back of my mind, that notification echoed. Why would someone create a fake obituary? And more importantly, who would target me? It wasn't like I was famous. I wasn't even all that well known. So why me? Why this? And why today? I turned back toward the living room, my gaze flicking toward the window. Something about the light had shifted. It felt colder, almost unnatural, as if the sun itself had been dimmed. But that was ridiculous, wasn't it? I shook my head, attempting to laugh off the feeling of paranoia creeping up on me. The sound of my phone buzzing again jolted me from my thoughts. I glanced down at the screen, half expecting another strange notification. But this time, there was a new message. From an unknown number. I hesitated. My thumb hovered over the screen. Maybe just another spam message, I muttered to myself, but my fingers betrayed me, swiping open the message. The text was brief. It's coming. You can't stop it. My pulse raced, and the room suddenly felt suffocating. I glanced nervously toward the door, as if someone might be watching me from the other side. I immediately closed the message and tossed the phone on the couch. But I couldn't shake the feeling something wasn't right. Something was off, and it wasn't just the phone, the weird obituary, or even the strange message. It was deeper. A quiet, pressing sense that everything around me was slowly slipping out of place. A sound, just a faint rustling, came from the hallway. I tensed. Maybe it was just the wind or the house settling. But then I heard it again. Louder this time. More distinct. Steps. Soft, slow steps coming closer. I stood there, frozen for a moment as the sounds grew nearer. My breath quickened, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I glanced at the hallway. Nothing. Just shadows stretching across the walls. But I couldn't ignore the feeling, the undeniable sense that something was wrong. Something was watching me. The door to the hallway creaked slightly, as if something or someone was about to step through. I quickly reached for my phone again, but it was still on the couch, too far out of reach. I took a step backward, my eyes never leaving the hallway. A shadow flickered at the corner of my vision, but when I looked directly at it, it was gone. The sound of footsteps ceased. For a moment, there was only silence. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't comforting. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that presses down on you, making your chest feel heavy, your thoughts scattered. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move, but the closer I got to the hallway, the more the air seemed to thicken. My heartbeat rang in my ears, louder than the silence, and I could feel the cold sweat forming on the back of my neck. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure, just at the edge of the hallway, barely visible, like a shadow against the darkness. I froze again, but this time I couldn't look away. I couldn't bring myself to turn my head and face it directly. Something inside me, something primal, told me not to. I just stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling the weight of its presence pressing down on me. Then the footsteps started again. This time, there was no mistake. They were real. They were coming closer. The footsteps grew louder, closer, more deliberate. My pulse hammered in my ears as I stood there, frozen. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to run, but my legs felt like stone. The figure in the hallway remained just out of clear view, as if teasing me, knowing I couldn't bring myself to confront it. The air around me felt thick, stifling, as if the house itself had started to close in. I glanced down at my feet, expecting to see the shadow of the figure cast on the floor, but there was nothing. Just the usual light filtering in from the window, casting long, thin lines across the hardwood. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand here. I forced my legs into motion, one foot in front of the other, until I was at the edge of the hallway. The floor creaked beneath me, the sound making me cringe. Every step felt like an intrusion into a space I shouldn't be entering. The silence was almost unbearable. Every small sound, the tapping of my shoes, the rustle of my clothes, felt amplified. The farther I moved, the more I could feel the weight of the presence in the air, like an oppressive force pressing down on me. The hallway stretched in front of me, dimly lit by the soft glow from the kitchen. The walls were lined with photographs, most of them faded from years of hanging. As I passed them, I could almost feel the eyes of the people in the photos following me. The figures, once smiling or frozen in time, now seemed almost ominous. My breathing became shallow, and I swallowed hard, but the lump in my throat wouldn't go away. My eyes flickered to the corner of the hallway, where the figure had been. But there was nothing there now. The space seemed empty. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. A noise behind me, soft at first, like something brushing against the floor, grabbed my attention. I spun around quickly, my heart leaping in my chest, only to find the hallway behind me just as empty as before. The sense of unease settled deeper in my gut. I turned back toward the darkened part of the hallway. And then I saw it. A faint movement, like the shift of a shadow, just at the end of the corridor. It was too fast to be a person, and too deliberate to be the natural play of light. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting and distorting, crawling along the walls like something alive. My breath caught. I wanted to scream, to shout, to run, but I couldn't move. I felt as though I were rooted to the spot by some invisible force. My mind raced, desperate to rationalize what I was seeing, but the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Was it a trick of the light? Was I imagining this? I stepped forward cautiously, but the floor creaked louder than ever. The sound seemed to echo through the house, filling every corner, every shadow. And then I heard it again. Footsteps. This time, they weren't in front of me. They were behind me, growing louder with each step. Slow, deliberate, just like before. I spun around, heart racing, and there it was, the figure. It was standing just beyond the kitchen, its shape barely discernible in the low light. For a moment, I thought it might be a person, maybe a prankster, maybe a neighbor, but as I took a step forward, the figure moved. It didn't walk. It slid. The motion was so unnatural, so fluid, that I couldn't comprehend it. It was as if the figure was melting through the air, slipping through the cracks of reality itself. The outline of a person, but not quite. Not human. I couldn't make out its face. It was hidden in shadows, but I could feel it watching me. I could feel the weight of its gaze, cold and calculating, like it knew something I didn't. My body was shaking now, a tremor running through me. My hands felt clammy, my fingers slick against the wall. The walls, once so familiar, now felt like they were pressing in on me, closing in on my every breath. The house had turned into something else, something foreign and hostile. I reached for my phone again, my fingers brushing against the cold metal. But before I could unlock it, the figure moved again, this time in my direction. It didn't make a sound, didn't even disturb the air, but I could feel its presence drawing nearer, closer, like a magnetic pull I couldn't escape. My throat tightened. My heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest. I had to leave. I had to get out of the house. But as I turned to run, a voice, barely a whisper, spoke. It came from nowhere, from everywhere, and it chilled me to the core. Don't you see? It's already too late. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even alive. It was a sound that cut through me, cold and ancient, full of dread. My hands trembled as I turned, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing. No one. Only that figure, still waiting in the shadows. I should have run. But I couldn't. The room seemed to tilt, the walls stretching and bending as if reality itself was warping. The floor under my feet felt unstable, as if I might sink into it at any moment. The air was thick, like I was breathing through a dense fog. And then, just as I thought I might lose my grip on reality altogether, the figure moved again. Slowly, deliberately. But this time, it wasn't the figure that terrified me, it was the fact that I couldn't see where it was anymore. It had disappeared. The house fell silent again. And I knew it wasn't going to stop. Not until it got what it wanted. And I wasn't sure I was going to make it out alive. I stood there, in the dead silence of the hallway, feeling the cold sweat drench my back. the absence of the figure didn't bring relief. In fact, the emptiness felt worse than the presence itself. It was the kind of silence that gnaws at your soul, the kind that fills the air with the fear of the unknown. The shadow was gone, but I could still feel it lingering, a heavy weight pressing down on me. I glanced toward the front door. The thought of escaping crossed my mind, but my feet wouldn't move. The feeling of being trapped, the sheer weight of it, was so overwhelming that I couldn't think straight. Every instinct told me to run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. I swallowed hard. Maybe it was just a dream, I thought. Maybe the exhaustion from the weird obituary and strange message had caught up with me. Maybe I had imagined the shadow, the voice, the footsteps. But then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, the creak of the floorboards in the living room. I froze again, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My heart raced in my chest, every muscle in my body locked in place. The sound grew louder, deliberate, each step following the other, just as before. No, it's not real. It can't be real. I turned slowly, not daring to make a sound. I could feel the darkness behind me, even without turning. It wasn't a physical darkness, it was something deeper, something cold and suffocating, like the very air around me had turned malevolent. My eyes scanned the hallway, desperately searching for any sign of the figure. But there was nothing, just the usual decor of the house, my childhood home, the familiar wallpaper, the cracked light switch, the painting of the lake that had always hung on the same spot. But they all felt wrong now. The walls, once comforting, now seemed to stretch and bend as if they were closing in on me. The air was thick, each breath I took seemed more labored than the last. And then, there it was again. A low, muffled sound, like something or someone shuffling just out of my sight. I jerked my head toward the living room. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the shadows of the room beyond swallowing the light. I needed to go in, check it, confront it, but my legs felt like lead. Every part of me wanted to bolt, to run out the front door and into the street, but I was paralyzed by the sheer weight of the fear clutching at my chest. I can't leave. It's already here. It's watching me. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. The figure wasn't gone. It was still here. Somewhere, waiting, watching. And it wasn't alone. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to move, step by slow step. The floor creaked under my weight, every sound amplified in the stifling silence. The walls felt like they were closing in on me with each step. As I passed the kitchen, the light flickered, just for a moment, like a warning. I had reached the threshold of the living room when the air shifted. It felt colder now, as if the temperature had dropped by several degrees. The hairs on my arms stood on end, a prickling sensation running up my spine. I swallowed again, but my mouth was dry. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, and every time I exhaled, I could see my breath mist in the air, like winter had suddenly come to stay. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something move. The figure. It was standing by the window. But this time, I could see more. The shadow wasn't just a shape anymore. It had form. A figure, tall and elongated, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles. It had no distinct features, no eyes, no mouth. Just a dark silhouette, moving fluidly like liquid darkness. It was watching me. I couldn't breathe. I wanted to run, but my feet were glued to the floor. My mind screamed at me to turn away, to escape, but my body refused to listen. All I could do was stare at the dark shape standing by the window, its presence so cold, so suffocating that it felt as if I were drowning in the air itself. And then it moved. It wasn't the slow, deliberate steps it had taken before. This time, the movement was swift, unnaturally so. It glided across the room, its form barely visible in the dim light, but its movement was unmistakable. It came closer, closer than I thought possible. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound deafening in my ears. Why isn't it making any sound? I wanted to scream, but my throat felt tight, like it was being crushed by invisible hands. My eyes locked on the figure as it approached, and for the first time, I felt its presence, its malevolent force pressing down on me, suffocating me. It wasn't here to scare me. It wasn't here to play. It was here to take. I closed my eyes for a split second, willing myself to wake up, willing myself to find an escape. But when I opened them again, the figure was closer. And it wasn't alone. Behind it, standing in the shadows, were others. Shadows. Dark figures, shifting like smoke, barely distinguishable from the darkness itself. The air was thick with something wrong. I could feel it now, crawling under my skin, through my veins, reaching deep into my soul. Why are you here? My voice cracked as I spoke the words, barely a whisper, but it felt like I had shouted them into the abyss. The figures didn't answer, but the one in front of me, the one I had seen first, stepped closer. It was close now, too close. I could feel its breath, cold against my skin, even though I knew it didn't breathe. I could feel its presence, filling the room, blocking all escape. It's not real. It's just my mind playing tricks. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew it wasn't true. It was too real. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached for my phone, but when I looked down, the screen was black. No notifications. No messages. Just darkness. And then the voice came again. But this time, it wasn't a whisper. It was a growl, low and guttural, something so foreign, so unearthly that it made my skin crawl. Too late, it rasped. The figures in the shadows closed in, and the room seemed to pulse with a sickening energy. And then, it happened. The world tilted. The room warped. The air, once cold, suddenly felt like it was burning, as if the very walls of the house were on fire. The shadows stretched out like claws, reaching toward me, pulling me into the darkness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was being swallowed whole, and I couldn't stop it. I don't know how long I stood there. Seconds? Minutes? Time felt irrelevant, like I had fallen out of it entirely. I couldn't escape the feeling that the world was slipping away from me, piece by piece. My body was still shaking, every nerve on edge, but my mind was racing in circles. The room, once again, seemed normal. Too normal. But the eerie quiet was suffocating. The walls, the ceiling, the floor, they all felt like they were closing in on me. I reached out a hand to steady myself against the wall, but it felt wrong. The texture, the warmth, it was there, but it didn't belong. Like I was touching something that shouldn't exist. I was breathing too fast, panic tightening its grip around my chest. I looked at my phone again, hoping for some sort of clarity, a message, anything that could make sense of what had happened. The screen was black, like it had died in my hands, but then the phone buzzed. The message came through. It wasn't from anyone I knew. There was no name, no number, only a single line of text. Do you remember? I froze. The words were simple, but they felt like they were carved into my brain. A question that didn't need to be asked. A question that was too familiar. It felt like the phone was taunting me. I could hear the low hum in the background, the subtle vibration that echoed deep in my chest, like the phone was alive, watching me. My hands were slick with sweat as I tried to focus on the screen, but the words seemed to blur and shift, almost as though they were moving on their own. I raised my eyes to the room again. It was exactly the same as it had been moments ago. The familiar furnishings, the pictures on the walls, the soft glow of the light fixtures. But this time, everything felt foreign. Every detail was too sharp, too crisp, like it had been magnified and distorted. And then, it happened again. The shadow flickered. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but no! There it was, just at the edge of my vision. A flicker of movement, a disturbance in the air, something unnatural. It was back. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just one shadow. There were more. Slowly, they gathered, shifting, coiling in the corners of the room, gathering momentum. The figures weren't just standing anymore. They were moving. I could see them clearly now, tall, elongated forms, their features indistinct, but their presence undeniable. Each one seemed to stretch and warp, like they were made of darkness itself, bleeding into one another. The room had become colder again, the air thick with something foul, something ancient. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't move, and I couldn't bring myself to tear my gaze away from them. The shadows were getting closer. Closer. Each one of them was moving in unison, sliding through the air, their movements too fluid, too unnatural to be anything human. I was frozen in place. Completely. The whispering started again. Low at first, like a hum, just beneath the surface. But it grew louder, more distinct. The words were distorted, as though they had been spoken through thick glass, or a faraway tunnel, but I could understand them. "You shouldn't have come back," the voice rasped, its sound scraping against my eardrums. The cold seeped deeper into my skin, making every part of me burn with an intense, unnatural chill. "Why?" My voice trembled as I spoke. "What do you want from me?" The air around me seemed to freeze, and the shadows paused. For a split second, everything stopped. And then, I saw it. The figure, tallest of them all, the one that had loomed at the edge of the room before, moved forward. It didn't walk. It glided. I could feel it, its presence pressing in on me, wrapping around me like a vice, until I thought my ribs would snap from the pressure. Have you ever had the feeling that something is just not right? Like the world around you is shifting and you're the only one who notices? I had been living in the same apartment for a couple of months now, nothing fancy, just a small one-bedroom in a quiet building on the outskirts of town. My life had settled into a comfortable routine: work, eat, sleep, repeat. There was a sense of calm in the predictability of it all. But recently, something had begun to disturb the peace. It started with the small things, the things you usually brush off. A pair of socks missing from the floor next to my bed. The TV remote I could have sworn was on the couch, but now it was on the coffee table. Nothing huge, nothing that would make you suspect anything out of the ordinary. But the longer it went on, the more unsettling it became. One evening, after returning from work, I walked into my apartment and immediately felt something was off. The air was different. The silence, heavy and thick, made it seem like someone, or something, was watching. But I didn't want to think about it. I convinced myself it was just a long day and I was tired. I went to my bedroom to relax and threw my bag onto the chair by the desk. But something caught my eye. Under my bed. At first, I didn't think much of it, just the usual clutter that accumulates when you live alone. A few forgotten objects, dust collecting in the corners. But as I stared at the darkness beneath the bed, something felt wrong. The shadows were too deep, too still. I could have sworn I saw movement, a subtle shift, like something was there, just out of sight. My heart skipped a beat. I told myself it was my imagination, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Curiosity got the better of me. I dropped to my knees and looked under the bed. The space was narrow, just enough for a few things to get lost. I reached for the flashlight I kept in my drawer and shone it into the darkness. There was nothing. Just dust, a few forgotten items, and the familiar emptiness. But then I saw it. A single, small item out of place, my phone charger. I never remembered leaving it there. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. The next night, as I prepared to go to bed, I heard something. A faint sound, almost imperceptible at first. Like a rustling, shifting movement. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. It was coming from under the bed. I stood still, holding my breath, listening. My pulse thudded in my ears. I slowly moved to the edge of the bed and knelt down, my flashlight in hand. Nothing. There was nothing there. But the feeling remained. Someone, or something, was close. Too close. I couldn't explain it, but every part of me screamed that I was not alone in that room. Unable to shake the feeling, I decided to take a step I never thought I would. I would set up my phone under the bed and record whatever was happening. Maybe then I would have proof. Maybe I was just overreacting, and the sounds had a rational explanation. The next night, I placed my phone on the floor, angled just right under the bed. I made sure the camera was on and set the recording to go for a few hours. Then I went to sleep, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that my every move was being watched. When I woke up the next morning, I immediately checked the footage. At first, it seemed ordinary, just the empty darkness under the bed. But as I skimmed through, something caught my eye. Toward the end of the recording, there was a subtle shift in the shadows. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But as I zoomed in, my heart nearly stopped. In the darkness, just beyond the edge of the phone's camera, two small, glimmering eyes stared back at me. They were watching me. I was paralyzed. The eyes blinked once, then vanished into the shadows. The phone slipped from my hand. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't unsee it. The question burned in my mind, what was that? I couldn't stop myself from thinking about it. The sound I heard before, the feeling of being watched, the charger out of place. Had it always been there? Was I losing my mind? I couldn't stay in the apartment anymore. But I had to know what was going on. What was living under my bed? I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, those eyes, the ones from the video, stared back at me. It wasn't just a hallucination. It was real. But how could it be? How could something have been living under my bed without me noticing? I paced around the apartment, trying to distract myself, but the apartment that had once felt like a safe haven now felt more like a trap. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the quiet was no longer comforting. It was oppressive. There was no escape from the creeping feeling that something was watching me from the dark corners of the room. I needed answers. and the only way to get them was to confront whatever was under the bed. But how? I was afraid that whatever it was, it might not be so easy to get rid of. The thought of staying in my apartment was unbearable, but leaving wasn't an option. The strange events had started to spiral out of control. I couldn't shake the image of those eyes. They weren't human. They were something else, something wrong. I decided I would take action the next day. I had to know what was happening. I couldn't live in this constant state of dread, feeling paranoid in my own home. I had to be sure. So I made a plan. I spent hours at the hardware store, buying items I thought might help me understand what was going on: an old-fashioned mirror, a thick rope, and a couple of long metal rods. The idea was simple. I would make sure whatever was under my bed couldn't escape. When I got home, I didn't waste any time. I moved the bed away from the wall and set up the mirror under it. It reflected the dark space beneath, a place I had never dared to truly inspect. The mirror would allow me to see everything in the darkness, every corner, every hidden inch. I felt a cold sweat form on the back of my neck as I got down on my knees and peered into the mirror. The shadows were still, lifeless. For a moment, I thought I might be overreacting. Maybe it had all been a mistake. Maybe I was just imagining things. But then the mirror caught something that made my blood run cold. A faint shift. A small movement near the farthest corner of the space under my bed. I held my breath. My eyes locked onto the spot. The shift became more defined. Slowly, someone was moving there. Something that didn't belong in a space so small. It was almost like a shadow, but darker. No, it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a figure. A long, thin shape that seemed to stretch in unnatural ways, crawling toward the edge. My pulse raced, my heart hammering in my chest. I should have run. I should have called someone. But I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure's head emerged from the shadows, and my blood froze. It was an unrecognizable face, twisted, like a grotesque version of a human. But there was something even more unsettling about it. Its eyes were too wide, too gleaming, as if they were absorbing all the light around them. They were staring straight into the mirror, directly at me. And that's when I realized whatever was under my bed had been watching me this whole time. A surge of panic shot through me, and I instinctively scrambled backward, knocking the mirror out of place. I couldn't breathe. My vision blurred, and my body was shaking uncontrollably. I heard a faint whisper, a raspy, guttural sound that seemed to crawl into my ears from all directions. "I see you." The voice was cold, distant, and yet right next to me. I stumbled to my feet, heart racing, my mind spinning. The room suddenly felt too small, the walls closing in on me. I had to get out. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My hands were clammy as I fumbled with the door, finally managing to escape into the hallway. But as I closed the door behind me, a thought lingered in my mind. What if it was still there? I spent the night at a friend's place, but I couldn't shake the image of that thing under my bed. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, the voice echoed in my mind, repeating its chilling words. The next day, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to go back and confront it. I needed to know what was in my apartment. But when I stepped back into the room, the sense of wrongness was even stronger than before. The apartment had been disturbed. Things were where I left them. The couch cushions were askew, the books I'd left neatly stacked were scattered across the floor. It was as though someone, or something, had been moving around while I was gone. I approached my bedroom slowly, as though expecting the figure to leap out at me at any moment. I didn't know what I was hoping to find. A sign? An explanation? A reason for all of this? But what I found was worse. Under my bed, the mirror was gone, and in its place was something far more terrifying: scratches. Long, deep gouges in the wood, as though something had clawed its way out from underneath. They were fresh, the edges still dark with what could only be blood. I backed away, my breath caught in my throat. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway. It was still here. I couldn't breathe. My eyes stayed fixed on the scratches under the bed, but my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. Blood? Was it blood? No. No, it couldn't be. The logical part of my brain screamed that it was impossible. It had to be some sort of mistake. But the rest of me, every instinct I had, told me something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. I backed out of the room, my heart thudding loudly in my chest. Every sound felt like it was magnified: the creak of the floorboards, the soft tap of my shoes against the tile, the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Everything felt amplified, like the house was alive with whispers just out of reach. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to leave. I needed to get away from this apartment, from the presence that seemed to be growing stronger every time I turned around. But when I tried to make my way to the front door, my body froze. My mind raced, but I couldn't move. Something was behind me. Something was watching me. It wasn't just a feeling. It wasn't paranoia. I could feel it, its eyes, like hot needles, burning into my skin. I turned around quickly, but there was nothing. Just empty space, the shadows stretching across the walls in unnatural ways. The apartment was eerily still. And yet, I knew something was there, just beyond the edge of my vision. I stepped back, my hand shaking as I reached for my phone. I needed help. I needed to tell someone. But when I pulled it from my pocket, I noticed something strange. The screen was cracked. I hadn't dropped it, hadn't done anything to damage it. But there, on the surface of the phone, were more scratches. Small, delicate lines, like the marks of fingernails. I pressed the home button, but the phone didn't turn on. It was dead. Completely lifeless. It's here. A chill ran down my spine as I slowly turned to look back at the hallway, toward my bedroom. I had to go back. I couldn't keep running away. It was like it had been waiting for me to leave so it could claim its hold over me. I didn't know how I was going to survive this. How could I fight something like this? Something that didn't even obey the rules of reality? The door to my bedroom was ajar, the faintest crack of light spilling out from the gap. I walked toward it, the darkness ahead swallowing every step I took. As I passed through the doorway, I was met with the overwhelming scent of something foul, like rotting meat mixed with mildew. The smell hit me so hard it made my stomach churn. It was coming from under the bed. I slowly sank to my knees, bracing myself for whatever I would find. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the mattress, pulling it up. The sound of the bed creaking was deafening in the silence. I dropped it to the floor, and the darkness below was revealed. There was nothing. Just emptiness. For a second, I thought maybe I had imagined everything. That I was overreacting, that my mind had conjured up these images in a desperate attempt to make sense of something I couldn't explain. Then, I saw it. A figure. It was a blur at first, just a shadow at the edge of my vision. But then it moved. It was quick, too quick to follow, like a flicker of darkness darting beneath the bed. I reached for the flashlight I had brought with me, shining it toward the space under the bed. The beam sliced through the dark, revealing only dust, old boxes, and the scattered remnants of things I had long forgotten. Nothing out of the ordinary. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something wasn't right. I slowly crawled toward the edge of the bed, the flashlight still pointed under it. As I leaned in closer, I noticed something strange. A faint outline, hidden in the shadows, that shouldn't have been there. It was a face. Just beneath the mattress, where no one could see. I gasped and recoiled, almost knocking the flashlight from my hand. My heart raced as I quickly scrambled backward, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. But when I took a breath and looked again, the face was gone. Disappeared into the darkness, leaving only the ordinary mess of things I had neglected. I should have left. I should have just walked out the door and never come back. But I couldn't. The need for answers had taken hold of me. I had to know what was going on. I had to face this thing, whatever it was. But when I turned to look at the bed again, something else caught my attention. On the floor beside it, there was a small, dark object. A key. It wasn't mine. I had never seen it before. But as I picked it up, a wave of unease washed over me. The key felt too familiar, too right. It was as if I had been holding it for years, but I had never realized it. And then I saw it. In the dim light of the flashlight, I saw a faint symbol engraved on the key, a shape I recognized. The same symbol that had appeared on my phone just days before, the same symbol I had seen in my dreams. It was the same shape that had been etched into the walls of the house. This thing, this presence, was no longer just under my bed. It had been in my life all along. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, suffocating me under the weight of what I had just found. The key, the symbol, all of it, it was connected. But to what? I held the key in my shaking hand, staring at the intricate symbol carved into its surface, feeling as though it was pulling me in, beckoning me to understand. But I didn't want to understand. I didn't want to know. The air in my room seemed to grow heavier. The walls felt like they were closing in, tightening around me. I could feel it again, the same sense of being watched. But this time, it wasn't just a feeling. It was something tangible, something cold and suffocating. The darkness had weight. It had a presence. I glanced around the room. Everything was the same, yet nothing felt right. The furniture, the walls, the very floor beneath me seemed to shift. My eyes kept darting to the corners, expecting something to move, to shift in the shadows. And yet, nothing. But I knew it was there. I could feel its presence. I couldn't escape it. I stood up quickly, the key still clutched tightly in my hand, and stumbled toward the door. But as I crossed the threshold, I froze. My hand shook as I reached for the light switch. But when I flicked it, the light didn't come on. The room was plunged into darkness. I turned and fumbled around for the flashlight I had dropped earlier. The beam of light flickered on, casting long shadows across the room, distorting the furniture into grotesque shapes. I have to leave. I need to get out of here. I turned back to the doorway. The hallway was silent. Empty. But it was too quiet. The silence felt suffocating, like it was pressing in on me from all sides. I had to get out. I had to escape this place before it consumed me. I stepped into the hallway, but before I could make it to the stairs, I heard a sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A soft shuffling noise, like something dragging across the floor. I froze, straining to hear. It came again, louder this time. It was definitely moving, something, or someone, was dragging itself toward me. No. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to face it, but my body moved of its own accord. Slowly, I turned to look behind me, the flashlight's beam shaking in my hand. And then I saw it. The figure. It was crouched on the floor, moving slowly, its body unnaturally contorted. It didn't look like a person, not fully. It was hunched over, its back twisted in a grotesque angle, the limbs bent in ways that were wrong, unnatural. Its skin was pale, stretched thin, as though it had been starved of life. And then there were the eyes, those eyes. They were watching me. It was watching me. It wasn't just a presence anymore. It had form. It had shape. And it was getting closer. I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the floor, my breath caught in my throat. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears, drowning out everything else. The figure's eyes glowed, flickering like candlelight in the darkness. I could see the outline of its face, twisted in a silent scream. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. And then it spoke. Leave. The voice was soft, almost like a whisper, but it carried an undeniable weight. It wasn't just a command. It was a plea, an order, something ancient and primal, like it was pulling at my very soul. My body jerked into motion. I didn't even think. I just ran. My legs felt like lead, but I pushed forward, down the hallway, toward the front door. I could hear it behind me, slow, dragging footsteps, scraping across the floor as it followed me. No. No, no, no. I reached the door and yanked on the handle, but it didn't budge. I pulled again, my fingers slipping on the cold metal, but it refused to open. The door was locked. It was always locked. Panic surged through me, flooding my veins with terror. I turned around, the light of the flashlight flickering and sputtering as I swung it back toward the figure. It was closer now. I could hear its breath, heavy, raspy, like it had been suffocating for years. I didn't think. I just acted. I turned, running toward the back window. I needed to get out. I needed to escape. But when I reached the window, the familiar scene of the city street outside was gone. The window wasn't looking out onto the familiar view I had known for years. It was dark, thick with shadows, but something was moving. Something was shifting in the blackness outside. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't make sense of it. But I knew I was trapped. Trapped in this place, this nightmare. And that figure was coming for me. The flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering onto the floor. I stepped back, my mind racing, desperate for a way out. I tried to think. I tried to find a solution. But all I could see was that face, those eyes, getting closer, inch by inch. Suddenly, the door behind me slammed open with a deafening crash. I didn't look. I couldn't. I didn't want to see it. But I heard it. The voice. That same whisper. Leave, or it will take you. I turned around, heart pounding, my body trembling. And there, standing in the doorway, was something worse than the thing under my bed. The door slammed open with a deafening crash. My heart stopped for a split second, and my body froze. I didn't want to turn around. I knew that whatever was standing behind me, it was the last thing I would ever want to see. The heavy, suffocating air in the room grew colder. My breath was coming out in shallow gasps, as if the very air had turned thick, each inhalation burning my lungs. What do I do? My mind screamed, but my body didn't respond. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were encased in concrete, my hands trembling at my sides. The room seemed to pulse with every passing second, the darkness around me growing darker, as if it were pressing in from all sides. And then there it was again, the voice. Soft, insistent, almost gentle, but it carried a command that I couldn't ignore. Leave, or it will take you. I swallowed hard, but no words came out. The figure at the doorway didn't move, it simply stood there, its shape barely discernible in the darkness. The dim light from the flashlight flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. And the shadows moved, twisted, as though they had lives of their own, stretching and curling like fingers reaching for me. Please, no. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to acknowledge what was there, but my head turned anyway, slowly, painfully. And I saw it. It wasn't human. Not anymore. The shape in the doorway was tall, but its proportions were wrong, too long, too thin. The skin was pale, unnaturally smooth, almost translucent. I could see the dark veins running beneath the surface, pulsing like they were alive. Its face, if you could even call it a face, was hollow, with wide, vacant eyes that seemed to stare right through me. And its mouth, wide and stretched, opened slightly, as if it were trying to speak, but nothing came out. It was wrong. So wrong. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing, my mind screaming in panic. The figure didn't move yet, but I could feel the pressure in the room intensifying, as if it were drawing all the energy from the space. The very air itself felt like it was being sucked away, leaving behind a suffocating emptiness. What is this thing? What does it want from me? And then I remembered the key. The key that had been left on my desk, the one I had found under my bed. It was the only thing that had changed, the only thing that had made a difference. The key wasn't just a random object. It had to be connected to all of this somehow. I glanced at the key still clutched in my hand, feeling its weight. The symbol on it burned into my mind, its meaning elusive yet undeniable. I had to do something. Anything. Without thinking, I rushed toward the key. I had to get out. I had to end this before it consumed me. But as I moved, the room seemed to shift, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. The air became even heavier, the darkness pressing closer with every step. The figure in the doorway remained motionless, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, watching, waiting. And then, the sound came again, the dragging. It was louder now, coming from behind me, closer. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just needed to get to the door, to the key, to the... Something brushed against my foot. I gasped, looking down in terror. It was a hand. A cold, skeletal hand emerging from under the floorboards. No, no, no! I jumped back, my heart pounding in my chest. The hand retracted quickly, as if it had never been there at all. But I knew it was real. I had felt it. It was alive. It wanted me. I turned back toward the door, ready to bolt for the exit. But the figure in the doorway was gone. I froze, the air thick with dread. It had disappeared. I didn't know whether to feel relief or fear. But before I could react, a voice, clearer this time, spoke from behind me. "It knows." I whirled around, but there was nothing there. No figure, no face in the doorway. Only darkness. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of something breathing behind me. I spun again, and there, standing in the middle of the room, was a shadow. A silhouette. But this time, I could see it more clearly. The outline was wrong. The limbs were too long, the body too twisted. And those eyes. I could feel them on me, digging into my very soul. They were full of something ancient, something beyond human comprehension. And they were hungry. "You should have left." The voice was a guttural rasp, like nails scraping across glass. It didn't sound like it came from the figure's mouth. No, the voice was coming from everywhere. It was in my head. It was all around me. My hand shook violently as I stumbled backward, my mind racing for an escape, but the room had no exit anymore. The walls had shifted again, and now they were solid, no door, no window. Just suffocating darkness. I looked down at the key in my hand. The symbol on it pulsed. It was alive. I raised it toward the figure, but it didn't move. It didn't react. Instead, I felt the key grow warm in my palm, hotter and hotter, until it felt like it was burning me. "The key," the voice hissed. "You cannot escape it. It will always find you." I screamed, but no sound escaped my mouth. The key in my hand shattered, the pieces falling away like ash, disappearing into the darkness. And then, silence. The figure was gone. The room was empty. But the key was gone too. And I knew that it was never meant to be found. It was a Tuesday. At least, that's what everyone kept telling me. I woke up like I did every other day, the dull light of the morning creeping through the blinds and casting long, lazy shadows across the room. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I picked it up, expecting the usual notifications, but there was something different about the date. It said Tuesday, but I knew something was wrong. I glanced at the clock, 6:47 a.m. No surprise there. But then I remembered, yesterday was also a Tuesday. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it must be a mistake. Maybe I had forgotten something, or my phone was glitching. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. How could 2 Tuesdays happen back to back? Confused, I stumbled out of bed and made my way to the kitchen. My roommate, Alex, was already there, sipping his coffee, his eyes glued to the screen of his laptop. I hesitated before speaking. "Hey, Alex, what day is it today?" I asked. He didn't look up. "It's Tuesday, obviously." I blinked. "No, I mean, yesterday. Wasn't it Tuesday too?" Alex finally looked up from his screen, a bemused smile playing on his lips. "Yeah, it was." "What's wrong? You okay?" I opened my mouth to reply, but the words felt stuck. Something about his response didn't sit right. I could see him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something in the room had shifted. There was a subtle tension in the air, something heavy, as though I wasn't supposed to ask that question at all. "No, yeah, I'm fine," I said, forcing a smile. "Just didn't sleep well." He nodded and went back to his laptop. But as I stood there, trying to shake off the creeping unease, I noticed something else. The subtle hum of the refrigerator was louder than usual. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed unnaturally crisp, almost mechanical. Even the light outside, filtering through the blinds, seemed wrong. It wasn't just daylight, it had a sharp, artificial quality to it, like everything around me was slightly out of sync. I shook my head. This wasn't normal. The rest of the day went on in a fog. Everyone around me seemed fine, going about their business like nothing was odd. But I kept asking myself, how could 2 Tuesdays exist in a row? Had I missed a day? Maybe I had somehow slept through an entire day. But that didn't explain why everyone else acted like nothing was amiss. I spent the day trying to convince myself that I was just overthinking things, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But even as I walked around, something about the world felt slightly off. The sounds were too loud. The air was too still. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one who noticed that something was wrong. Later that afternoon, I ran into Sarah, a friend from work, at the coffee shop. She smiled as she saw me approach. "Hey, you're here early for a Tuesday," she said, her tone light, but there was something in her eyes that made me pause. "How's it going?" I was about to respond when I noticed something strange. She was wearing the same clothes she had worn yesterday. The same outfit. Same shoes. Same everything. I froze. "Sarah, weren't you wearing that yesterday?" Her smile faltered. "What?" You're wearing the same thing as yesterday," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Didn't you wear this to work yesterday?" Her eyes darted to the side, then back at me. I must have. It's not like it matters, right? Anyway, how are you? You look kinda out of it." I didn't answer. My heart was racing. Something was happening. I was slipping, and I didn't know why. Everyone else was moving on like they hadn't noticed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was hiding something from me. As I left the coffee shop, the sky overhead seemed to stretch longer than it should have. The clouds moved too slowly, and the wind, it didn't feel like wind. It was too quiet. I found myself walking faster, my footsteps echoing in the empty street. And then, just as I was passing the familiar park bench, something caught my eye. There, on the ground, was a crumpled piece of paper. I bent down to pick it up, and my stomach lurched. It was a note, scrawled hastily in black ink. "Don't ask. Just keep going. It's not real." I stood there, staring at the note. My fingers trembled as I held it. It was the strangest feeling, like I had just stumbled upon something I wasn't supposed to see. Something that had been waiting for me to find. I looked around, expecting to see someone watching me. But the street was empty, eerily so. I shoved the note in my pocket and kept walking, the unease gnawing at me, growing deeper by the second. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events of the day, trying to make sense of it all. But there was one thing I couldn't ignore, the overwhelming certainty that something had changed, and I wasn't the one who had missed it. The clock on my nightstand read 11:42 p.m. And then, as I stared at it, I noticed something. The second hand, it had stopped moving. I leaned closer, feeling the cold sweat on my forehead. It wasn't moving. It wasn't possible for it to stop. Time had simply stopped. I reached out, touching the clock. The second hand trembled, just for a moment, before it jerked forward. The sound of the ticking echoed through the room, but it wasn't the same. It felt like it was fighting against itself. My phone buzzed again. I picked it up, heart pounding. It was a message from Sarah. Just one line, "I hope you're ready to forget." And then, before I could even process it, the message disappeared. The screen went black. I tried to turn it back on, but nothing happened. I pressed the power button repeatedly, but it was dead. A chill ran through me, and I understood, finally. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a glitch. Something had stolen a day from me. The world around me had shifted, but no one else seemed to care. And I was the only one who knew it was missing. The following morning, I woke up to the sound of my alarm clock blaring in my ear. My heart was still racing from last night's strange events, but I tried to push the feeling down as I reluctantly dragged myself out of bed. The clock on my nightstand read 7:15 a.m., and though it wasn't unusual to wake up a bit earlier than needed, today felt different. The morning light that filtered through the curtains was too bright, too sharp, and it made my head throb as if I hadn't gotten a good night's rest, though I knew I'd been lying in bed, unable to sleep, for hours. The room felt colder than usual. A strange draft seemed to creep in through the cracks in the window, and for a moment, I thought I heard soft whispers, just beyond my hearing, like faint echoes of someone talking. But when I turned, the room was empty, silent, the air stale. I rubbed my eyes and stood up, pushing the lingering dread from last night away. But as I looked in the mirror, something made my blood run cold. My reflection was different. Just a little, but enough to make my stomach twist. There was a subtle shift in my face, like I was seeing a distorted version of myself. My eyes were too wide, too alert, and my skin appeared paler than usual. I blinked hard, willing the image to settle, but it didn't. I stepped back from the mirror, shaking my head. "It's just stress," I told myself. I hadn't been sleeping well, and stress was making my mind play tricks. I needed to calm down. But as I turned away from the mirror, my phone buzzed again. I grabbed it off the counter, and there was no mistake. The message was still there, "I hope you're ready to forget." My finger hovered over the screen, and this time I opened it. It wasn't like the message had disappeared, but it seemed odd. Like it had been written for someone else, not me. The tone was all wrong, like Sarah wasn't the one who had sent it. I tried to respond. "What do you mean?" I typed, my fingers trembling. I had to get some clarity. I couldn't keep losing my grip on reality. But as soon as I hit send, the message vanished. I stared at the blank screen for a long time. This wasn't normal. I couldn't just be imagining all of it. I wasn't crazy. I knew what I'd seen. But now, it was like the world itself was starting to erode beneath my feet. I left the apartment and decided to head to work, hoping that the familiar routine of the day would ground me. Maybe if I focused on something, anything, I'd be able to make sense of this. But as I stepped out onto the street, the same unsettling feeling gripped me. The world felt too still. The usual hum of the city, cars honking, people talking, the distant sound of sirens, was all but gone. The air felt heavier, almost oppressive. It was like I had stepped into a version of the world where time itself had become warped, stretched out of shape. When I reached the subway station, I saw Alex. He was standing near the entrance, talking to someone, but the moment I stepped into view, he stopped. His gaze flickered towards me, and I saw something there, something I couldn't place. It wasn't just surprise. It was like he had seen a ghost. I approached, trying to shake off the gnawing feeling in my stomach. "Hey, you okay?" I asked. He seemed distant, and that smile I'd gotten used to seeing every day now seemed stiff, forced. "Yeah," Alex said, but his voice lacked its usual warmth. "Just tired." "You know." I didn't buy it. Something was off. I tried to ignore the tension in the air as we walked toward the platform. We were quiet for a while, both of us caught in our thoughts. But just before I boarded the train, Alex turned to me, his expression serious, his voice low. "Do you ever get the feeling like things are happening that you didn't sign up for?" he asked, his eyes darting to the side. "Like the world's a little off?" I froze. His words echoed the very thoughts I had been battling with all day. He knew. "You felt it too?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced around, making sure no one was listening. "Don't talk about it here," he murmured. "Not yet. It's not safe." Before I could ask him more, the train doors slid open, and he stepped inside without another word. I stood there, the sound of the doors closing behind him ringing in my ears. I watched the train pull away, my thoughts racing. What had he meant by that? What wasn't safe? The rest of the day dragged on. The sense that something was wrong only grew stronger. I caught snippets of conversations that didn't make sense, glimpses of people who seemed out of place. I overheard someone talking about the day before, but the details didn't add up. They spoke about events I didn't remember happening. Conversations I was sure I hadn't been part of. As I sat in my office, my mind kept racing back to the clock in my room. The one that had stopped. Was that a warning? Or was it something more, something deliberate? That night, I couldn't bear to be alone in the apartment anymore. I needed answers. But where could I turn? Who could I trust? The people around me were acting like everything was fine, but I knew they weren't telling me the whole truth. I grabbed my jacket and headed to Sarah's apartment. Maybe she could explain what was happening. If anyone could, it would be her. She was always the practical one, the voice of reason. When I arrived, I knocked 3 times, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I turned the handle, and to my surprise, the door creaked open. It wasn't locked. Hesitantly, I stepped inside. The apartment was dark, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. I called her name, but there was no response. The silence seemed to swallow my words whole. I walked through the hallway, past the living room, and toward the bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and as I peered inside, my blood ran cold. The room was empty. But on the bed, in the center, was a single item. Something small and insignificant, yet it made my heart stop. A watch. My watch. The one I thought I'd lost days ago. The moment I saw the watch on Sarah's bed, my breath caught in my throat. It was impossible. I hadn't seen that watch in days. The last time I remembered wearing it was, no, that wasn't right. I couldn't remember. How long had it been since I had last seen it? I reached out tentatively, my fingers trembling as they grazed the cold surface of the watch. It was an old, silver model, nothing special, but to me, it was significant. I had inherited it from my grandfather, who had passed away years ago. It was one of the few things that had grounded me when everything else felt uncertain. The thought that it had somehow appeared here, in Sarah's apartment, unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. I picked it up, feeling its weight in my palm, but the moment I held it, a chill ran down my spine. It felt wrong. The hands of the watch were moving, but not in a natural way. The second hand was skipping, jerking ahead in strange, uneven intervals. I glanced up towards Sarah's bed. The room was still and quiet, but the air felt heavier, as if something were lurking just out of sight. I shook my head, trying to push down the panic. This is just a coincidence, I told myself. I was grasping at straws, looking for answers in the wrong places. But then I noticed something even stranger. The bed was perfectly made, as if no one had slept in it. The room looked untouched, too untouched, like time itself hadn't reached it. A heavy silence hung in the air, and my mind couldn't stop racing. Where was Sarah? Why was her apartment empty? I looked around the room again, and this time I saw it. On the floor, just by the edge of the bed, was a small scrap of paper. It was folded neatly, as though it had been placed there intentionally. My hand shook as I reached down and picked it up. Unfolding it carefully, I read the single, short sentence written in Sarah's handwriting. "Don't trust the day." My heart skipped a beat. I couldn't comprehend what I was reading. Was this some kind of warning? Had Sarah known something I didn't? Don't trust the day. What did that even mean? Suddenly, the air in the apartment felt even colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally along the walls. My mind raced back to earlier when I asked Alex about things feeling off. His words echoed in my head now. "Don't talk about it here," he had said. "Not yet. It's not safe." I quickly stuffed the note into my pocket, trying to force my breathing to calm down. I couldn't make sense of any of this. But one thing was certain, I needed to find out where Sarah was, and fast. Something wasn't right, and it wasn't just me who felt it. I left her apartment, trying to steady my steps as I walked back down the hallway. The elevator ride felt longer than usual, and the quiet hum of the building seemed louder, somehow. I could feel eyes on me, even though no one was there. My pulse quickened as I stepped out onto the street, the watch still clutched tightly in my hand. As I walked, the sound of my footsteps echoed against the pavement, too loud, too clear in the otherwise silent city. The streetlights flickered above, casting strange, shifting shadows across the road. The city, usually so full of life, now seemed like a desolate, empty place. Even the people I passed seemed distant, as though they were somehow disconnected from reality. And then I saw it. Across the street, standing by a street lamp, was a figure I recognized. Alex. I rushed over to him, feeling the weight of the watch in my pocket. My mind was a blur, but I had to know. I had to get answers. "Alex." I called, but his back was turned to me. He didn't react. I quickened my pace, reaching out to tap his shoulder. But as my hand brushed against him, he spun around, his eyes wide with something, not quite fear, but something close. He didn't say anything at first. He just stared at me, his breath shallow. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "What's happening to us?" Alex took a step back, as if the words themselves had physically pushed him away. "You're not supposed to remember," he said, his voice trembling. "You weren't supposed to remember any of it." The words hung in the air like a threat. "Remember?" I echoed, confusion washing over me. "What are you talking about? What's going on with the day? Why is everyone acting like..." "Stop," Alex interrupted, his face pale. You don't understand. None of us do. He looked around nervously, then leaned in, lowering his voice to a whisper. The day, it's been taken. Something took it. That's why you're feeling like this. You're not going crazy. There's something in the fabric of time, and it's rewriting everything. I stared at him, my heart pounding. Something in the fabric of time? It sounded absurd, impossible. But as I looked at Alex, I saw the genuine fear in his eyes. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a prank. I wanted to demand more answers, to ask him what the hell he meant, but before I could speak, he grabbed my arm. You need to get away from here. Get to the park. I'll meet you there. They are coming. I tried to process what he was saying, but before I could respond, Alex turned and disappeared into the shadows. I was left standing alone in the middle of the street, my head spinning with 1,000 questions and no answers. But I knew one thing for sure now. I had to go to the park. Something was coming, and I wasn't sure I'd make it out in one piece. I didn't know why I listened to Alex. It wasn't like I had any other option. The city, once so familiar, now felt like a maze, twisted, disjointed. Every corner, every shadow felt like it was watching me. But when Alex told me to go to the park, something inside me just obeyed. Maybe it was his look of genuine fear. Or maybe it was the instinctual feeling that whatever was going on, I needed to get ahead of it. I walked, trying to shake off the sense that I was being followed. Each step seemed louder than the last, the echo of my footsteps bouncing off the buildings that loomed around me like silent sentinels. The streetlights blinked in and out, flickering as if they too were uncertain of their place in time. The world around me felt wrong, like a dream that had started to unravel. When I finally reached the park, the cold air hit me, sharp and unsettling. The usual sounds of the city seemed muffled here, replaced by an eerie silence that felt unnatural. Even the rustling of the leaves in the trees was oddly subdued, like they too were afraid to speak. I couldn't see Alex anywhere. He hadn't given me any specific place to meet, just the vague instruction to come to the park. The wide, empty space stretched out before me, the shadows of the trees casting long, distorted shapes across the ground. The park had always been a place of peace for me, somewhere to clear my mind, but tonight it felt like the opposite. It felt like a place where time itself had been warped. I walked further into the park, hoping to spot Alex. My fingers gripped the watch in my pocket, the metal cold against my skin. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something in the distance. The feeling of being watched intensified with each step. And then I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the faintest scrape of shoes against the gravel. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound came again, closer this time. It was too deliberate, too slow. It wasn't the wind or a stray animal. Someone or something was following me. I turned quickly, but the park was empty. I stood there for a moment, straining my ears for any other sound, but all I heard was the soft rustle of leaves. Maybe I'm just imagining it, I thought. The paranoia was starting to get to me. But then, the sound came again. This time, louder. I snapped around and started walking faster, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't know what I was running from, but I couldn't stop myself. Every instinct screamed that I needed to move, to get away. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the park near the old fountain. Its outline was barely visible in the dim light, but I could make out the shape of a person. I didn't recognize them, but I knew they were waiting for me, waiting in the shadows. Without thinking, I ran toward them. I didn't know why I was drawn to them, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this person held the answers I needed. As I got closer, I slowed down, cautiously approaching. The figure didn't move. "Alex?" I called, my voice sounding hollow in the quiet night air. The figure didn't respond. I stopped a few feet away, studying them. They were tall, with dark hair, wearing a long coat. Their face was turned slightly away from me, as though they were trying to remain hidden in the darkness. I took another step forward. "Are you Alex?" I asked again, my voice shaking. Finally, the figure turned. But it wasn't Alex. The face that looked back at me was familiar, but twisted in a way that made my stomach drop. It was someone I hadn't seen in years. Someone I thought was long gone. It was Sarah. She was standing there, frozen, her eyes wide with fear. Her lips parted, but no words came out. I could see the terror in her eyes, as though she had seen something beyond my comprehension. "Sarah?" I whispered, taking a tentative step toward her. But she didn't move. Her gaze remained fixed, staring right through me. And then, without warning, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness as though she had never been there at all. I stood there, staring at the spot where she had been, my mind reeling. What the hell just happened? My heart raced as I scanned the park, trying to understand what I had just seen. The chill of the night air pressed in on me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the darkness. Something was wrong. Something was horribly, horribly wrong. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard a voice. This time, it was unmistakable. "Alex." "Don't turn around," he said, his voice strained. "Just keep walking. And don't stop." I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I recognized the urgency in his voice. Something was behind me. I didn't dare turn. I just followed his instructions, my feet moving before I could think. The sound of footsteps behind me began again, only this time they were closer. Much closer. I quickened my pace, feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Every instinct told me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The figure, whatever it was right behind me now. I could feel its presence, like a dark weight pressing in from all sides. I glanced back over my shoulder, just for a second. And there, in the distance, I saw her again. Sarah. But this time, her face was different. Her eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to pull in the very light around her. Her mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. I turned and ran. The park blurred around me, the trees turning into jagged shapes in my periphery. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could hear were my own panic breaths and the relentless pounding of footsteps behind me. Was it Sarah? Was it something else? I didn't know anymore. I only knew one thing: I couldn't stop running. And I wasn't sure I could escape. My heart thundered in my chest, every beat reverberating through my whole body. The air was thick, suffocating, as though the very atmosphere around me had turned against me. My legs screamed for rest, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't afford to stop. The park stretched on, but no matter how fast I ran, the feeling of something closing in on me grew sharper. Every shadow seemed to twist and move as if reaching for me. The moon hung low in the sky, casting its eerie light across the twisted branches of the trees. The wind howled through the leaves, but all I could hear were the frantic footsteps behind me, matching my pace. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, the distance between us seemed smaller. Don't look back, I told myself. Just keep running. But I couldn't help it. I turned again, and there she was. Sarah. Her eyes were black pits, empty and hollow. Her grin had stretched impossibly wide, far beyond any human limit. Her skin, pale and stretched tight, glowed in the moonlight, and her fingers twitched as though they were waiting to reach for me. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching, like a phantom waiting for its prey to falter. My breath hitched, and my pace quickened. No, 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 I thought desperately. This can't be real. She's not real. But every step I took only seemed to make the terror worse. The park was no longer familiar. The familiar path that led to the entrance had disappeared. The trees had closed in, forming walls of darkness on either side of me. There was no escape. Just the constant sound of my own footsteps, the rhythmic pounding of my heart, and the terrifying feeling of someone or something always just behind me. The air felt heavier with each breath I took. I could almost taste the fear, thick on my tongue. I could feel my mind beginning to slip, reality blurring and shifting. Was this happening? Was it all in my head? Or was this something else? Something far worse? The darkness pressed in around me like a living thing, wrapping its cold, suffocating fingers around my chest, making it harder to breathe. But there was no time to stop. There was no time to think. I had to get out. I had to find a way out. I pushed myself harder, running blindly now. The sound of her laughter echoed around me, soft at first, like a distant whisper. But the more I ran, the louder it became. It was as if the very ground beneath my feet was laughing at my fear. I glanced to the left and saw it, an alleyway that hadn't been there before. A break in the trees. It seemed like an opening, a way out. Without thinking, I veered left and sprinted toward it, praying it would lead me somewhere, anywhere but here. The alleyway was narrow, the walls closing on either side. The air smelled stale, like old paper and decay. My feet slapped against the uneven ground, the sound of my shoes echoing off the stone walls. There was no turning back now. I pushed forward, faster, feeling my pulse racing in my throat. The alley seemed to stretch endlessly, its twists and turns becoming more erratic. But the laughter, that low, echoing sound, still followed me. No matter how fast I ran, it never stopped. Then, the path ahead changed. What had once been an alleyway now seemed like a long, dark tunnel. The walls narrowed, pressing in until they felt like they were about to crush me. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. The tunnel was closing in around me, making it impossible to breathe, impossible to think. And then I heard it. A whisper. Not the laughter this time. A voice. Soft, but chilling. You can't outrun it. I froze. The voice was familiar, but distorted. It wasn't Sarah's voice. It wasn't Alex's either. It sounded like my own voice, but deeper. Like a twisted version of myself, calling from somewhere just beyond my reach. You can't outrun it. I turned, searching the dark tunnel for any sign of where it came from. But there was nothing. Only the shadows. Only the darkness that seemed to have swallowed everything. I'm losing my mind, I thought, but the thought wasn't comforting. It was terrifying. What if I had already lost my mind? What if this was just some twisted dream and I couldn't wake up from it? And then I heard it again. This time, closer. You can't outrun it. I spun around, my eyes wild with fear. But still, there was nothing. Only the darkness pressing in, closing around me tighter until I felt like I couldn't breathe. The ground beneath me shifted. I stumbled, trying to catch myself, but it was as though the earth was moving, changing beneath me. I reached out, grasping for anything to steady myself, but there was nothing. The walls were slick, like oil, and I slid helplessly down the surface. My legs kicked out from under me, and I crashed to the ground. For a moment, everything was still. The sound of my breath was deafening in the silence, but it wasn't the relief I had hoped for. The silence was wrong. Too wrong. I looked around, frantic, and saw nothing. It was as if the whole world had disappeared. I could hear the voice now, clear as day. It was no longer a whisper. It was right beside me, so close that it was almost impossible to tell if it was coming from the air around me or from my own mind. You can't outrun it. I closed my eyes, unable to bear it anymore. My heart was racing, my mind spinning. I didn't know where I was, or if I was even still alive. The tunnel, the park, Sarah, it was all a blur now, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. And then, I heard something else. A crack, like a twig snapping, and then another. The sound of footsteps. Slow. Steady. They weren't mine. They weren't Sarah's. I wasn't alone anymore. Thank you for making our stories part of your relaxation time. We hope they brought you a sense of peace and transported you to a world of fantasy and mystery. If you enjoyed the stories, feel free to leave us a review. Your feedback inspires us and helps us make the content even better. Now, unwind to the calming sounds of rain and thunderstorms, which will continue to set a tranquil mood. Let these sounds carry you gently into the realm of dreams. Don't forget to like our page if you haven't yet. Wishing you a restful night's sleep. Relax, rest well, and good night.